The story begins not with an empire in triumph, but with a wound one so deep that even centuries later it seeps through marble mosaics and myths. Constantinople, the so-called crown of civilization. The meeting point of continents and creeds was a city that glittered on the surface but bled underneath. Every morning the call of traders along the Mise blended with the distant roar of the hippodrome, a place where spectacle and politics, pleasure and violence, faith and corruption intertwined until the boundaries disappeared. Here power wasn't just exercised, it was performed. This is where Theodora's story begins. A child born into a city that could raise saints and monsters from the same soil. A girl who would one day wear purple, the colour of divine authority, but only after crawling through the filth of the empire's most obscene entertainments. She would become an empress whose laws still shape our legal systems, whose name still sparks debate among historians, and whose life remains one of the most brutal case studies in how trauma can be transformed into strategy. But to understand her rise, we must first look beneath the gold leaf to the machinery that built the Byzantine illusion. Because Theodora was not born powerful, she was manufactured by systems designed to break her. By the early 6th century, Constantinople was a world addicted to entertainment. 80,000 people could pack the hippodrome on a race day, chanting for either the blue or the green faction, their shouts echoing off the marble like thunder. These weren't mere sports teams, they were political networks, guilds, mafias, governments in miniature. They provided jobs, loans, protection, and when necessary, punishment. Allegiance to a faction could decide whether your family ate or starved, whether you lived safely or disappeared into the night. Every craftsman, every charioteer, every dancer or beast handler lived at the mercy of these two colours. Even emperors were cautious around them. The mob could anoint or destroy with a single chant. The city itself pulsed like a living organism, its arteries, the aqueducts, its lungs, the harbours, and its heart, the hippodrome. In that heart-blood was both metaphor and reality. The screams of men torn apart by animals mingled with the laughter of children eating roasted nuts. Senators, monks and beggars sat side by side, united by appetite. Violence was democracy's last surviving ritual. It was in this world that a humble family of bear trainers, the keepers of the beast that fought for public amusement, believed themselves safe. They served the Greens, the faction that controlled half the empire's entertainments. Their loyalty was rewarded with a small home near the animal pen's steady pay and the illusion of permanence. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural, and now softly tell me, where are you listening from? Then one morning that illusion shattered. The father Asacus was found dead, his body mauled by one of the very bears he trained. A tragic accident said some, a factional message whispered others. In Byzantium, death always carried politics in its teeth. For his widow and 3 daughters, the rules were supposed to be clear. In the world of faction employment, jobs passed through bloodlines. If a man died, his son or wife inherited the position, a system that kept thousands from starvation. But this time something broke. A single bribe gold slipped into the hand of a green official named Asterius, transferred the job to another man. The safety net was cut. Overnight, the family fell from security into desperation. It's tempting to think history turns on wars or decrees, but more often it turns on petty corruption. One official's greed, one mother's impossible choice. In this case, a bureaucrat's signature condemned 3 children to a fate worse than hunger. Theodora's mother, nameless in most chronicles, stands at the crossroads of every oppressed society. Choose morality and watch your children die, or trade dignity for their survival. She chooses the second. To modernize, it seems monstrous. But in the Byzantine world, morality was a luxury the poor could not afford. The entertainment industry, a euphemism for a vast trafficking network, fed on such families. It promised shelter, food and fame, and delivered something far darker. By the time the sun set that day, the woman had done what countless desperate mothers before her had done. She took her daughters to the hippodrome. To the city's elite, the arena was a place of laughter and pageantry. To her, it was a marketplace of equals. Imagine the scene, the air thick with incense and sweat, the stone seats alive, with 80,000 voices, the sand below darkened by blood. At the centre stood a woman clutching 3 trembling girls dressed in laurel wreaths and thin silks, the costume of supplicants. She wasn't there to entertain, she was there to beg. The gesture was ancient. When a faction member died, widows could appear before the crowd to request employment for their children. The audience's response determined their fate. But this time the crowd turned cold. The Greens, the faction that had taken her husband's life and livelihood, refused. Silence, then laughter. Rejection. It's one of history's cruelest ironies that the acts meant to preserve her children's lives would sell them instead. Because standing in that audience watching were recruiters, men who specialised in finding new performers for the Hippodrome's darker shows. The kind of shows even Rome had outlawed. Theodora was only a child, but her education had begun. From that moment, her story stops being about personal misfortune and becomes a case study in civilization's moral economy, how empires recycle pain into profit. Every lash, every cheer, every coin tossed into the arena was part of a larger system, one that converted suffering into spectacle, spectacle into distraction, and distraction into control. And somewhere in the back rows of that vast stone theatre beneath banners of blue and green, 1,000 powerful men watched, unaware that the girl trembling before them would one day decide the fate of them all. Before Theodora became a symbol, before she was a lawgiver, an empress, a myth, she was the daughter of a man whose life depended on animals. Asakos, the bearkeeper of the Green faction, was not a rich man, but in Constantinople his position was gold. He belonged to one of the great power networks that ran the empire beneath its polished mosaics, the blues and the greens. To outsiders they were racing clubs, teams of charioteers. To insiders they were governments within the government. Each faction had its own hierarchy, treasuries, guilds and informants. They built hospitals, managed theatres, paid for bread and buried their dead. They controlled employment contracts, marriages even, who could sell fruit in a certain district. And they had militias armed and loyal that made even the Imperial Guard cautious. To live without a faction's protection was to live naked before the law. The factions offered not just work but identity. They were family, tribe and insurance policy in one. In the teeming neighbourhoods near the Hippodrome, banners of blue and green hung from balconies like declarations of faith. People baptised their babies in faction colours. They married within the same allegiance. Fights broke out in bakeries over which charioteer would win the next race. This was no harmless sports rivalry. Beneath the chants of blue-green ran the deeper fault lines of society itself, theological, economic and political. The blues leaned toward the aristocracy, toward the wealthy merchants and orthodox clergy. The greens drew their strength from artisans, labourers and the restless poor. But alliances were fluid and betrayal was common currency. Asakos's position as the bearkeeper placed him at the very heart of this system. Every spectacle required beasts, lions, panthers, leopards and bears imported from Asia Minor and the Caucasus. He trained them, fed them and made sure they mauled on command but not before. A misstep could mean disaster for performer and animal alike, but the job came with prestige. A man who worked the arena was a man who mattered. His name was known to officials, his children could expect apprenticeships. His wife could buy oil and bread on credit, in a city where half the population depended on daily rations that meant survival. He was in a sense the empire in miniature, a man who controlled creatures stronger than himself serving masters stronger still. The Hippodrome was his workplace, his church and his cage. When Asakos led the bears through the narrow tunnel into the blinding light of the arena, the crowd roared not for him but because of him. Every claw, every growl was part of the choreography of domination. The emperor himself might be watching from the kathisma, flanked by guards and bishops pretending that the empire's order was ordained by heaven. In truth, it was kept alive by men like Asakos and by the unspoken terror that their beasts inspired. That illusion of order ended the day he died. The details are lost, whether a mistake, a drunken assistant or a hungry animal turned too soon. All we know is that one morning the bearkeeper's body was found mauled, his tunic soaked with blood, the green faction seal still pinned to his chest. In Byzantium, even death was bureaucratic. The faction clerk would have logged the incident, reported the loss of an employee, and noted the vacancy in the registry. For the family, that registry was everything. It meant the difference between a roof and the gutter, between protection and abandonment. The rule was simple: the position of any deceased faction worker passed to his immediate family. It was how widows survived, how children ate. But rules bend under gold. Asterius, the Green faction's dancing master. The man responsible for assigning entertainment posts took a bribe. A few coins, perhaps a favour, and he gave the coveted role of bearkeeper to another man. With that one transaction, an entire family fell out of the empire's social fabric. No letter of protest, no audience with an official could undo it. The family was not simply unemployed, they were erased. Without faction backing, they no longer existed in the eyes of the city. They couldn't buy on credit, couldn't appeal to courts, couldn't walk safely through the markets. The streets of Constantinople were merciless to the unprotected. It was a city where plague, famine and debt hovered over every alley. Refugees from Syria, Cappadocia, and Egypt crowded the waterfront, sleeping beneath arches and selling their children to survive. The empire's splendour, its gilded domes, its marble forums, was built directly atop that misery. And now, Theodora's family joined the invisible. Her mother, accustomed to a modest but stable life, suddenly faced the unthinkable: how to feed 3 daughters with no wage, no patron, and no hope of re-employment. The Greens, whose emblem still hung on their wall, turned away. Faction loyalty was conditional, it ended. When usefulness did. Asterius's decision was not unique. Corruption was woven into Byzantine survival. Positions were bought and sold like spices, and human lives adjusted accordingly. Yet this particular injustice would reverberate through centuries. It was the hinge of a tragedy that would turn into empire. Because what Asterius saw as a small transaction, a job transferred, a bribe accepted, was in truth the spark that lit one of the most improbable ascents in history. A child thrown into the gutter would one day sit on the throne. For now, though, Theodora's world had shrunk to a few narrow streets and the echo of the hippodrome crowds. Each night from her cold room near the stables, she could hear the chants rising through the city, the blues and the greens, calling for glory, for blood, for spectacle. She didn't know it yet, but she was listening to the rhythm that would shape her entire life, the sound of masses worshipping power without ever touching it. It begins with a single decision, small, local, and unseen. Asterius, the Green faction's dancing master, sits at his table surrounded by parchment and seal wax. Outside, the streets hum with news of Asacus's death. Inside, the ink dries on a bribe. A name is struck out, another written in. The bearkeeper's position, once belonging to a man whose sweat and loyalty had served the Greens for years, is sold to a stranger. No funeral, no condolences, no pension, just a line in a ledger. That was how survival worked in Constantinople, not by justice but by a transaction. When word reaches Asacus's widow, the sound she makes isn't a scream, it's something quieter, more animal, more final. The sound of a person realizing that her family has fallen through the last safety net. Her daughters, 3 of them, one barely out of infancy, cling to her robe. In their faces she sees not innocence, but a question she cannot answer: what now? Theodora is the middle child. She doesn't yet understand politics, but she knows hunger. She sees it first in her mother's trembling hands as she measures out the last handful of grain. In Byzantium, poverty arrives not like a storm, but like a slow illness. One day the bread seller smiles when you ask for credit, the next he looks away, then the butcher refuses you. Then the neighbours stop opening their doors. Within days, the family's world collapses into one room. The Green faction, whose colours still hang over the door, turns its back. Their silence is not cruel, it is administrative. There are rules, and Asterius's word is law. The widow's appeals are laughed away by clerks too busy counting their own bribes. In the Byzantine capital, mercy was not a moral act. It was a service one had to afford. So the mother begins to calculate. It's not an emotional decision, but an arithmetic one. 3 mouths, no income, no allies, no way to feed her children through winter. And then comes the thought that must have haunted her nights the hippodrome. To most citizens, it was the empire's beating heart, a temple of spectacle, a place where commoners and emperors shared the same sky. To her it became something else, the last marketplace where desperation still had a price. The hippodrome wasn't just for races. Behind the scenes, it was an entire economy, the circus industry of the Byzantine world. Thousands of workers, charioteers, animal trainers, dancers, musicians, prostitutes and recruiters. It fed on beauty and fear on bodies that could be used and discarded. And like all great systems, it disguised exploitation as opportunity. Everyone in Constantinople knew what it meant when a widow brought her daughters to the hippodrome. It was a ritual older than the city itself, the presentation of supplicants. The mother would dress her children in simple tunics, place laurel wreaths upon their heads, and lead them into the arena during a public gathering. The gesture was meant to be symbolic, a plea for the faction to restore the dead man's position, or to find the children other work. But somewhere along the way, the custom became corrupted. Spectacle devours meaning. What had once been a gesture of mourning turned into theatre. The crowd didn't see 3 hungry girls, they saw novelty. Something to point at, to laugh at, to forget. When the widow of Asacus stepped into the arena, that day she crossed the boundary between citizen and commodity. Her daughters, trembling in the open air, were no longer children. They were inventory. The audience of 80,000 roared not with pity but delight. They came for blood, for laughter, for distraction from their own poverty. The green seated in their section booed. The blues, out of rivalry more than compassion, shouted their support. A mother's humiliation became a factional performance. Among the spectators were the hippodrome's recruiters, men whose job it was to find new talent for the empire's endless appetite for entertainment. To them, the girls represented profit, the younger the better. The crowd's reaction was their signal. The Green's rejection was final. No job, no production, no bread. But the Blues, ever eager to embarrass their rivals, intervened. They offered the widow's new husband a position tending horses in the Blues' stables. A small mercy born not of kindness but of politics, and yet that single act of pity would decide the course of history. Because in that moment something formed inside the 10-year-old Theodora, a wound with its own intelligence. She watched the Greens betray her family, the Blues save them, and the crowd treat their pain as entertainment. And she learned the first lesson that would shape her empire. Power and pity are twins. Both can be performed. Both can be used. The Hippodrome's sands had always been soaked with blood, but that day they absorbed something else, the seed of vengeance. Historians call it fate. Psychologists might call it conditioning. But in truth it was training. The Hippodrome was more than a theatre. It was a school. His lessons were cruelty, spectacle, and control. And like every student who learns from pain, Theodora was a fast learner. In the coming years, she would walk those same tunnels her father once did, not as a daughter of a worker, but as part of the entertainment herself. The line between performance and prostitution, between applause and abuse, was vanishingly thin. In Byzantium, the law made no distinction. Actresses were legally classified as prostitutes. Their labour was pleasure, their consent irrelevant. For the city, it was business. For Theodora, it was an education in how civilization feeds on suffering while pretending to condemn it. And while the senators and bishops cheered from their cushioned seats, none of them imagined that one of those trembling girls in the sand would one day sit above them all, wearing their empire's purple commanding armies, rewriting laws, and holding the very system that created her by the throat. The bribe that Asterius accepted had bought more than a job. It had purchased the empire's most dangerous mind. The Hippodrome was the empire's theatre of appetite, a place where faith, cruelty, and entertainment coexisted so seamlessly that people forgot where one ended and the other began. Its marble benches could hold 80,000 souls, a population large enough to crown or destroy an emperor in a single afternoon. On ordinary days, the air trembled with the roar of the crowd and the pounding of hooves, but on certain days it hosted something darker, performances so obscene that even ancient Rome, with all its gladiators and orgies, had once outlawed them. It was on one of those days that a little girl named Theodora first learned what power sounded like when it cheered. Imagine the noise, tens of thousands chanting faction colours, the Blues and the Greens, splitting the city like rival gods. The air was hot, the sand beneath her feet smelled of sweat and animal blood. She could barely see over the heads of the dancers waiting their turn. Her mother whispered prayers that no one could hear over the roar. This was her audition. Not for fame, not for art, for survival. The performance was simple in theory, monstrous in practice. The girls' children really would dance, gesture, sing if they could. The crowd would judge whether they were fit for the stage, but everyone knew what the stage meant. In Constantinople, entertainment was a euphemism. To dance was to be offered. To perform was to be owned. The mother had dressed her daughters in cheap wreaths and pale tunics, the garments of supplicants. When the herald called her forward, she led them by the hand into the sunlight. Tens of thousands of faces turned toward them. Merchants, soldiers, priests, senators, all hungry for distraction. The silence before the laughter was worse than the laughter itself. She bowed low as custom demanded, and made her plea, her husband dead, her children hungry, her loyalty still to the Greens. But Asterius, the faction official who had sold her husband's job, ignored her. The crowd jeered. A coin struck her shoulder. Someone shouted that the Greens had enough beggars. Others called for the Blues to take her a taunt more than an offer. Then came the moment no historian ever writes, but every mother can imagine. She realized she could still turn back, walk away with dignity and starve, or continue and live. She continued. She made her daughters dance. No written source describes the choreography, and yet the silence of the chroniclers says enough. The act was designed to humiliate, not entertain, a living advertisement that the children were now available for hire. Every movement was both a performance and a declaration of ownership. The crowd clapped not because the girls were talented, but because their suffering amused them. From the imperial box, courtiers watched as if it were nothing, one more act in a long afternoon of blood and jest. For them, the difference between theatre and exploitation no longer existed. Constantinople's elites had turned degradation into policy. Even ancient Rome, infamous for gladiatorial death matches and public executions, had drawn certain lines. By the 3rd century, imperial law forbade sexualized performances involving children. But the Byzantines, draped in the rhetoric of Christian virtue, revived the very practices their ancestors had condemned. They just changed the language. What had been called prostitution in Rome became artistry in Constantinople. What had been a crime in one empire became culture in the next. The law itself made the deception complete. Under the Codex Theodosianus, actresses, dancers, and performers were legally identical to prostitutes. The category was called infames, the dishonoured. Those who bore it could not testify in court, could not inherit property, could not appeal to law. They were citizens in body only. No protection, no recourse, no name that history would remember. And so Theodora, barely 10 years old, entered that caste. She didn't just lose her father, she lost the right to justice. Her life now belonged to the entertainment system that had consumed her family. The Hippodrome's recruiters knew exactly what they were buying. They were not looking for beauty, they were looking for pliability. For children who could be trained, who could be reshaped into living commodities. The process was efficient, industrial in its precision. Every performer was catalogued, taxed, and inspected. Some were assigned to comedic troupes, others to acrobatic shows, others to the dark spectacles whispered about in taverns. And beneath the bleachers in the shadowed rooms where the audience never looked, contracts were signed. Flesh was a ledger entry. That evening, as the torches flickered over the empty arena, Theodora sat alone on the cold steps, staring at the sand still marked by her footprints. Somewhere behind her, her mother was bargaining for a place to sleep, her sisters crying quietly into the folds of her robe. The night smelled of oil and iron, the scent of the Empire's machinery still grinding. It is easy, centuries later, to imagine the Hippodrome as a monument, an archaeological ruin, a postcard, a tourist stop. But for Theodora it was a university, not one of books or scholars, but of survival. Every scream, every cheer became a lesson. She learned how crowds could be swayed, how pity could turn to cruelty in a heartbeat, how power could hide behind laughter. She learned that the masses could be manipulated not through logic but through rhythm, spectacle and fear. And as she watched the recruiters count their coins, she learned her first and most enduring truth in Byzantium. Morality was theatre, and the audience always paid for tickets. What began as degradation soon turned into education. Theodora was not yet a woman, but she already understood what most philosophers never learned, that pain can be studied. It can be measured, categorized, and eventually used. By the time she was 11, the Hippodrome had become her classroom. The sand beneath her feet, her desk. The audience, her instructors. And the lesson repeated night after night was always the same: power is a performance. At first she cried after every show. The laughter of the crowd followed her into sleep. But tears are currency the powerful cannot afford, and Theodora was learning to be powerful. Soon she stopped crying. Instead, she watched. She began to take note of the men who paid for her humiliation, senators who cheered loudest when the acts grew crueler, merchants who shouted wages on how long the performers could last. The more she watched, the more she understood the empire's rulers were not gods. They were addicts, addicted to pleasure, to control, to the spectacle of their own dominance. Each night as she lay awake in the perfumed dark of the performers' quarters, she replayed the scenes in her mind. She dissected every glance, every laugh, every hesitation. She began to see the invisible levers that moved men: desire, fear, guilt, shame. Where others saw the tormentors, she saw patterns. And in those patterns, the beginnings of strategy. In Byzantium, the public loved to pretend that the Hippodrome was just a place of games. But the games were political laboratories. The Blues and Greens didn't merely cheer chariots, they organised riots, shaped laws, and negotiated imperial policy. Even emperors trembled before the mob that filled those seats. A single chant of Nika Conquer could change the course of history. Theodora, watching from the sand, grasped that truth, long before the scholars did. The crowd's emotion was power waiting to be harnessed. But first she had to survive it. The acts she performed were never art. They were lessons in humiliation. The most infamous was called Leda and the Swan, a grotesque parody of Greek myth. Theodora would lie naked in the arena while trained geese plucked barley seeds from her body as men roared and threw coins. To the audience it was titillation disguised as theatre. To her it was fieldwork. Every hand that tossed a coin, every cheer that rose from the stands revealed something how far the human spirit could fall when pleasure disguised itself as power. Even her abusers became data points. The senators who demanded private performances were often the same men who legislated morality in public. They came to her, cloaked in authority, left trembling in shame. Theodora learned to memorize their faces, their weaknesses, their requests. She kept them like a ledger, one that would one day buy her freedom. No one taught her rhetoric, but she learned persuasion. No one taught her mathematics, but she learned calculation. No one taught her philosophy, but she learned human nature. In a city of theologians and generals, her mind was the sharpest blade no one saw being forged. Historians often call her story one of survival, but that word feels too small. Survival suggests passivity, endurance against the storm. Theodora was not passive, she was an observer, an archivist of human vice, building a private library in her mind. Every humiliation was a page, every night in the hippodrome was a chapter, and slowly she was writing the book of her revenge. The world of the performers was an empire of its own, built beneath the empire of marble and gold. There were hierarchies, alliances, rivalries, dancers who spied for senators, acrobats who passed messages between factions, courtesans who whispered politics in the dark. In that underworld, Theodora discovered another truth: information was more valuable than virtue. When a merchant's wife visited the backstage quarters to purchase silk from the performers, Theodora noticed which jewels she wore and which ones she didn't, a clue to household debts. When an official's messenger brought gifts, she listened to which faction colours he used when he cursed. Every secret was a key. And Theodora collected keys. The older performers mocked her for her silence. They called her the little statue because she spoke so rarely. But silence was her weapon. She knew that the loudest voices drew attention, and attention was dangerous. So she learned to disappear in plain sight, quiet, obedient, watchful. Even the men who bought her believed she was dull, submissive, unremarkable. And she let them. They never noticed the way her eyes flickered, recording every word. It is easy to call her manipulative, but manipulation was the only language her world spoke. The empire itself was built on performance emperors, posed as gods, bishops as moral arbiters, generals as holy warriors. Theodora merely learned the same grammar. By her early teens, she had become the favourite of the crowd and the terror of her employers. She had learned how to perform submission while controlling the scene. If the audience wanted laughter, she gave them laughter. If they wanted shame, she offered shame, but on her terms. Behind every gesture, she controlled tempo and tone. This was the hidden genius of Theodora's education. She learned that power was not about strength or birthright. It was about control of perception. The one who sets the rhythm commands the dance. Years later, when she sat beside an emperor, her words would still echo with the cadence of the hippodrome. She would rule an empire the same way she once ruled the crowd, not by domination, but by directing its emotions. Theodora was no longer a victim. She was a strategist in training, studying the empire's deepest weakness, that its rulers believed themselves untouchable. And she knew what the hippodrome had taught her every night: nothing that bleeds is untouchable. It was not a rescue. It only looked like one. When the governor of Libya, Hysebulus, or Hybelus, as some chroniclers call him, first saw Theodora perform, he saw what every powerful man sees when desire meets ownership opportunity. She was 16 now, no longer a child, her body carved by exhaustion and discipline into the kind of grace the empire mistook for beauty. To him, she was not a person, but an acquisition, a glittering thing to be taken, displayed, and controlled. He made his offer in front of witnesses, wrapped in the language of generosity. He would take her into his household, grant her silks, jewels, attendants, and freedom from the arena. To a girl who had spent her life beneath jeers and torch smoke, it must have sounded like salvation. But salvation in Byzantium was just another word for captivity under better lighting. When the ship left Constantinople's harbour, Theodora stood on its deck watching the domes fade into gold mist. She didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that every escape carried a price tag, and she intended to make sure this one paid dividends. Libya, 516 CE. Hysebulus' palace stood on a cliff overlooking the sea, a fortress of marble and scented courtyards. He was Rome's man in Africa, a provincial governor whose authority stretched over armies, trade routes, and the lives of thousands. But inside those walls, his universe shrank to a single obsession: Theodora. To outsiders, she was his concubine. To Theodora, it was her graduate education in power. For nearly 4 years, she studied him as she had studied the hippodrome crowd, not with emotion, but with precision. She mapped his appetites the way generals map terrain. She learned which compliments made him reckless, which silences made him afraid. She learned that even the most powerful man can be reduced to a trembling creature when his pride depends on a woman's attention. Every evening she performed a different lesson in control, sometimes through tenderness, sometimes through withdrawal. She discovered that dependency could be engineered, that affection once mirrored and withheld became a leash. Hesebelus prided himself on mastery over province's soldiers and slaves, yet in private he became her experiment. She found that physical pleasure was not the strongest tool, humiliation was. The same way the hippodrome crowds had learned to love degradation, had Hesebelus learned to love submission. And Theodora, remembering her own past, recognized the symmetry. For the first time she was not the spectacle, she was the choreographer. The villa's servants whispered that their governor was bewitched. He forgot meetings, neglected petitions, and ignored correspondence. Merchants waited months for signatures. Military officers complained that orders were late or contradictory. At night the corridors glowed with lamplight long after midnight, and the sound of voices, laughter, pleading command drifted through the air. Theodora was not content to be adored. She wanted to see how far influence could stretch before it snapped. So she began to test it. She would suggest gently that a tax remission might win him popularity, that a certain merchant should be favoured, that a military appointment would please a friend. At first Hesebelus complied, eager to impress. Then he began to notice patterns, decisions he hadn't intended to make, letters sent in his name that didn't sound like his voice. And still he could not resist her. He tried to reassert control with the anger, only to find it slipping again beneath her calm. The more he punished her, the more she learned. The palace became a laboratory in human contradiction, dominance, eroding into dependence, cruelty, twisting into desire. It was during this period that Theodora began to understand the most dangerous law of intimacy, control given freely as control that cannot be reclaimed. But her experiments in persuasion could not remain private forever. Governors were not kings, they were servants of the emperor, and every decision echoed through the bureaucracy. When complaints from Libya reached Constantinople about erratic policies, dismissed officials, missing funds, the rumours began. A woman, a dancer, a witch. Hesebelus heard them too. At first he laughed. Then as his reputation frayed, laughter turned to paranoia. Theodora's suggestions, once charming, now sounded like commands. Her wit felt like mockery. Each time she smiled, he saw a mirror reflecting his own weakness, and in that reflection something in him snapped. One evening during a feast he confronted her before his court. Theodora had spoken too freely, or perhaps only smiled at the wrong guest. He rose trembling with fury, his voice cracking above the music. "Get out!" he shouted. "Out, you worthless whore!" He flung her jewels into the fire, her clothes into the dust. The courtiers watched in silence, knowing better than to intervene. That night Theodora walked out of the palace barefoot, her silks burned her reputation in ashes. But in her mind she carried something Hesebelus could never destroy: knowledge. She had seen how desire corrodes power, how men who command armies can be enslaved by a whisper, how the balance between ruler and subject can flip in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She was no longer a girl sold into exploitation. She was a woman who understood the anatomy of control. As she made her way north across the Mediterranean routes that linked Africa to Alexandria, she sold what she had to survive, not just her body but her intelligence, her memory, her gift for conversation. But this time she was not being used. She was practicing. Every port was a classroom, every admirer a case study. She learned what traders feared most: loss, what priests feared most: exposure, what sailors feared most: loneliness. Hesebelus had thrown her out thinking he had destroyed her. In truth, he had given her the one thing Byzantium never intended her to have: freedom. By the time her ship reached the harbours of Egypt, Theodora was ready for her final transformation. She had graduated from the empire's cruelest university, and now she was prepared to teach. Theodora left Libya with nothing: no coin, no servants, no silks, not even her name untainted. Yet in the ancient world there were other forms of wealth: memory, observation, the ability to listen without being seen. She carried all three. The voyage north should have been a punishment. For her, it became an education. The sea lanes that stitched Africa to the eastern Mediterranean were more than trade routes, they were veins pulsing with information. Each ship was a floating marketplace of rumour and power: merchants boasting of fortunes, sailors drunk on stories, priests arguing over heresies, envoys whispering about wars. Theodora moved among them as both shadow and listener, a woman no one noticed until it was too late. In Alexandria, she learned her first rule of survival at sea. The body pays the fare, but knowledge keeps the deck. When she couldn't afford him to passage, she traded conversation a story here, a secret there. Men expected her to flatter them. Instead, she disarmed them with curiosity. She asked about winds trade goods, distant ports. What they told her freely became her invisible map of alliances, contraband routes and human weaknesses stretching from Egypt to Syria. Alexandria itself was a crossroads of every vice the empire denied in public. Its taverns reeked of wine and wet salt. Its streets teemed with philosophers, heretics, and spies. She watched the city's debates, monophysites against Chalcedonians, each claiming to know the nature of Christ, each willing to kill over a definition. She saw that belief, like desire, was another form of hunger. Both could be exploited. By the time she found a berth on a merchant ship bound for Antioch, she knew the value of information. In the ancient world, a woman who listened was more dangerous than one who spoke, so she listened. She learned that certain captains smuggled dyes forbidden by imperial monopoly Tyrian purple, the same hue reserved for the emperor's robes. She memorized which coves along the Levantine coast were used to hide cargo from tax collectors. She learned which governors were about to be replaced, which generals had fallen out of favour, which senators were being blackmailed for their pleasures. Each night when the crew slept, she replayed it all in her mind, cataloguing, cross-referencing, building the web of a future she had not yet admitted to herself. And slowly something within her hardened into certainty. She had been taught to think of herself as disposable. Now she understood that disposability was camouflage. The powerful reveal themselves in the presence of those they consider beneath notice. Theodora had become invisible by design, and invisibility was the perfect disguise for a strategist. When storms struck the coast near Cyprus, sailors prayed to saints promising offerings for safe passage. Theodora prayed for nothing. She watched the sky, the waves, the rhythm of men's fear. She was learning timing, when to speak, when to withhold, when to let panic do the work for her. Later she would use those same instincts not to weather storms, but to command them. In Antioch she disembarked into a city alive with contradiction. Gold-domed churches gleamed beside brothels. Philosophers lectured while slaves were auctioned in the plaza. It was here that the next layer of her transformation took shape. She had arrived with no patron and no faction, but she had something rarer, an understanding of how power spoke in private. Men believed she had nothing left to offer but her body. She let them think so, or each evening she entertained traders, officials, priests, whoever could pay. But what she sold them was illusion. What she took from them was intelligence. A merchant from Tyre bragged about shipping contraband silk to the capital through disguised monasteries. Theodora remembered the route. A Syrian priest confessed after too much wine that his bishop secretly supported the monophysite heresy despite swearing allegiance to Constantinople. She memorized the name. A general passing through on his way to Armenia whispered that the emperor's nephew Justinian was reforming the bureaucracy to consolidate power. She stored that detail away like gold. Information had replaced coin in her purse. By day she walked the markets, blending with women who sold bread and incense. By night she sat in rooms thick with smoke, drawing confessions from men who thought they were the hunters. They didn't notice how she guided their words, how every boast turned into a revelation. It was in Antioch that she first met Macedonia, an older performer from the Blue faction, weathered, but shrewd, who recognized in Theodora the unmistakable stillness of someone planning an ascent. Macedonia told her that a certain prince in Constantinople had been asking about the dancer who survived Libya. His name was Justinian. To most that rumour would have sounded like fantasy. To Theodora it was a summons, but she didn't rush home. She knew that returning to Constantinople without leverage would make her a curiosity at best, prey at worst. So she built her final shield reputation. She began to attend religious gatherings of monophysite Christians, the empire's persecuted sect. There she met Timothy III, Patriarch of Alexandria, who welcomed her not as a sinner, but as a soul redeemed. To him she confessed repentance. To herself she confessed strategy. Religion offered what politics and flesh could not, legitimacy. In a world ruled by men, holiness could open doors that beauty could not. By the time Theodora boarded the ship for Constantinople, she had reinvented herself again. No longer a courtesan, no longer a performer, but a penitent woman, carrying letters of introduction from respected clergy. The same sea that had once carried her away in chains now bore her back as its quietest conqueror. She leaned against the ship's rail as the waters darkened toward the Bosporus. Behind her lay years of humiliation ahead, the city that had made and discarded her. The skyline shimmered golden domes, bronze statues, the echo of 1,000 prayers rising from the great church. Somewhere in those streets a man named Justinian was waiting. He didn't yet know it, but the tide that carried her home was about to alter the empire's course forever. Theodora's conversion was never about guilt. It was about geography, spiritual and political. In the Byzantine world, faith was not just belief, it was territory. To align with one doctrine over another meant choosing an army, a patron, and a destiny. And in a city where orthodoxy was the language of loyalty, heresy could be the language of survival. When Theodora sought refuge among the Monophysites, she was not fleeing sin. She was joining a network. The empire in her time was obsessed with the question of Christ's nature. Was he two natures, human and divine, as the Council of Chalcedon decreed, or one united and indivisible as the Monophysites proclaimed? To most citizens it was theology. To Theodora it was infrastructure. Each sound controlled bishops, monasteries, trade guilds and cities. To belong was to be protected. To be excluded was to starve. Timothy III, the Patriarch of Alexandria, was the soul of that movement, a learned man who disguised rebellion as theology. His followers were persecuted, yet they endured by creating their own underground system of letters, couriers and safe houses stretching from Egypt to Syria. For Theodora, who had spent years learning to read power in silence, the Monophysite network felt familiar, covert, intelligent, bound by shared pain. When she arrived in their gatherings, the dimly lit chapels, the whispered prayers by lamplight, the others saw a repentant woman. They saw humility, tears, and the weary grace of one who had suffered too much to lie. What they didn't see was calculation. She listened as Timothy preached that true faith could not be destroyed by imperial decree. She nodded as he spoke of unity of Christ made one with suffering humanity. But what she heard beneath the theology was the language of resistance. The Monophysites had built something the imperial court could never fully control, a community that transcended law and faction. It was a second empire, invisible and durable. For Theodora, this was revelation. She had spent her youth studying the mechanics of domination, how bodies' desires and fear could be turned into instruments of power. Now she was witnessing a different kind of machinery, belief, loyalty, shared persecution. And she understood that it could be just as strong. Her conversion was public enough to be noticed, private enough to be doubted. The perfect balance. Among the faithful she was a redeemed sinner, proof that even the fallen could be lifted. Among the powerful she was a curiosity, the former performer, who now quoted scripture with trembling hands. But behind every pious gesture she was building relationships. Timothy's followers included merchants, midwives, ship captains and scribes. They helped one another with quiet efficiency, sending letters across borders, smuggling food during famines, sheltering fugitives. It was a web of loyalty that no emperor's spies could untangle. Theodora inserted herself into it like a thread of gold among flax. She visited monasteries in disguise, distributed alms she could not afford, and memorized the faces of every cleric, trader and artisan who might one day owe her a favour. Faith, she realized, could be an armor, but also a signal. To wear the monophysite cross was to declare, I am one of you, I suffer as you do. And suffering in a world defined by hierarchy was its own currency. This was not hypocrisy, it was strategy refined into piety. Theodora believed enough to be convincing, and that was enough to change her life. In the monophysite meetings, she found language for what she had already practiced in the shadow's endurance, secrecy and transformation. Timothy himself saw her potential. He praised her devotion, gave her letters of introduction, and told her to carry light where darkness reigns. He meant faith. She heard something else access. In Constantinople, the Orthodox Church and the imperial court were nearly one body. Doctrine shaped appointments, taxes, even marriage laws. Orthodoxy was the emperor's mirror-polished, blinding, unforgiving. But monophysitism offered Theodora an alternate reflection, one that allowed her to exist outside the official gaze while still appearing holy. To convert was to step sideways into a different layer of power. Later historians would argue whether her faith was genuine. Perhaps it was belief and ambition are rarely pure, but sincerity was never the point. For a woman branded infamis faith offered the one thing law could not, legitimacy. When she prayed among the exiles, her voice low and trembling, she was rehearsing a new role, not performer, not courtesan, but intercessor. The kind of woman people trusted to whisper their fears to heaven. And yet even as she knelt in candlelight, Theodora's mind was never still. She listened to gossip about bishops and governors about changing tides in the capital. She learned that the heir apparent Justinian was fascinated by prophecy and tales of redemption, that he asked questions about penitent women and stories of miraculous reform. In that moment, Theodora realized what few ever do: faith and politics were not enemies. They were the same script spoken in different tones. When she finally returned to Constantinople, it was not as the outcast who left, but as a woman draped in divine narrative. Her past could now be retold as pilgrimage, her suffering as sanctification. She carried no gold, but her reputation shone brighter than coin the sinner, turned saint the lost found again. And somewhere in the city's palaces, the man who would become emperor was already listening for stories just like hers. In the ancient world, reputations travelled faster than ships. By the time Theodora's vessel reached the harbour of Antioch, the story of the penitent dancer had already become a kind of legend. Whispered along the merchant routes, the girl from the hippodrome who had fallen into degradation vanished into the deserts of Africa and returned reborn in faith. The empire loved redemption stories almost as much as it loved sin. Among those who heard it was a woman named Macedonia, a veteran of the blues entertainment corps. Her body bore the years of the trade, stiff hands, scarred feet, eyes that had seen too much. But her mind was still sharp and her memory long. When she met Theodora again, she saw what most could not. This was not the same girl who had once danced before the jeering crowds. Over bread and watered wine in a smoky Antioch tavern, Macedonia leaned closer and lowered her voice. "He's asking about you," she said. "The emperor's nephew, the one they call Justinian." Theodora's eyes didn't widen, they narrowed. Justinian. The name meant power and danger. He was 40, but perhaps older, a man whose ambition burned hotter than his health could bear. Provincial by birth, born in the dusty Balkans, he had climbed into the imperial palace through discipline and brilliance, not blood. By the time he reached the rank of Caesar, he had rewritten the empire's bureaucracy in his own image, efficient, austere, relentless. He rarely slept. He studied law the way generals study maps. His courtiers said he could recite entire legal codes from memory and prayed at dawn before turning to budgets at noon. His uncle Emperor Justin III had no children, and the entire court knew Justinian would inherit the throne. But for all his intellect, Justinian was a solitary man. He trusted few and loved none. He had spent years surrounded by flatterers, priests and lawyers, the empire's most polished masks. And then, in whispers from his agents and entertainers, came the tale of a woman unlike any other, a former performer who spoke like a philosopher, who served no faction and who had survived what should have broken her. He began asking questions. Who was she? Was she real? Was she reformed or dangerous? In Constantinople, rumours were oxygen. They rose through the city's layers like incense, from the taverns to the palaces, from the wharves to the hippodrome box seats. Within weeks, Theodora's name was on the lips of courtiers and clerics alike, though never spoken too loudly. Some said she was a holy woman blessed by Timothy of Alexandria. Others said she was a spy sent by the Monophysites to seduce the heir. Both were true and neither. By the time Theodora set foot again in the capital, she could feel the tension in the air, the weight of an empire waiting for its next ruler, the quiet fever of ambition in every corridor. Constantinople had changed little: the smell of salt and incense, the cries of beggars at the gates, the glint of marble in the morning sun. But to Theodora it felt smaller now. She had seen too much of the world to be awed by its grandeur, and yet within its walls her future waited. The bureaucracy that surrounded Justinian was a labyrinth of scholars, accountants and spies, men whose loyalty could be purchased or destroyed with a rumour. They worshipped efficiency but despised imagination. Their faith was paperwork, their god the seal. Into that grey world stepped Theodora, a creature of colour, movement and insight. For the first time, her study of human weakness would meet the ultimate test in a man who ruled not by pleasure but by logic. When their paths finally crossed, it wasn't in the glare of the hippodrome or the opulence of the court. It was fittingly at a gathering of clergy and officials debating doctrine. Justinian attended to monitor orthodoxy. Theodora, invited by sympathetic Monophysites, came to show piety. The meeting was crowded, the air thick with argument and candle smoke. He saw her before she saw him, a woman seated quietly near the back, her face lit by the flicker of flame, her expression serene yet unafraid. Later chroniclers would romanticize it. The prince entranced by a penitent beauty, but the truth was subtler. Justinian was not conquered by her looks, he was intrigued by her composure. He was surrounded by men who trembled in his presence, yet she met his gaze and did not look away. It was not seduction, it was recognition. Theodora saw the loneliness beneath his command. The rigid discipline that had made him master of an empire had also left him starved for understanding. And Justinian saw in her a mind as sharp as his own but tempered in fire not marble halls. He began to seek her out at first under the guise of theological discussion. They spoke of mercy, of justice, of the strange ways in which God uses suffering to forge strength. But beneath the language of faith lay something else, two tacticians circling, measuring, learning each other's patterns. For Theodora this was familiar terrain. She had studied the desires of men all her life, but never one like this. Justinian's hunger was not of the flesh, it was of the spirit. He longed for someone who could mirror his intellect, soothe his conscience, and reflect his greatness back at him without fear. She gave him all three, and in doing so she began to weave the most dangerous tapestry of her life, one spun not from silk or flesh, but from admiration. The courtiers noticed the change first. The prince smiled more, spoke with warmth, quoted scripture with uncharacteristic tenderness. They whispered that he was in love, and then that he was bewitched. To them, a former circus girl rising towards the throne was an impossibility, a scandal. To Theodora, it was simply the next logical step in her long education. She had studied the crowd, she had studied the powerful. Now she was studying a prince, and as always she learned faster than anyone expected. What unfolded between Theodora and Justinian was not a romance in the sentimental sense, it was an experiment. Two minds trained by opposite worlds began orbiting one another, testing gravity. He, the prince of order and law, worshipped systems and discipline. She, the child of chaos, had learned that systems could be rewritten through emotion. Their encounter was not chance, it was convergence. At first their meetings were veiled in propriety, a discussion after a sermon, a shared stroll through the palace gardens under the guise of theological curiosity. Yet beneath the scripture and the polite conversation, Theodora was conducting the same analysis she once used in the hippodrome. Every pause, every question, every flicker of tone became data. Justinian was not like the others. He could not be conquered by beauty or desire alone. He needed to feel that he was being understood. Theodora gave him that abundantly. She let him lecture her on law, pretending awe. She asked about the moral fabric of empire, about mercy versus justice, and when he spoke she listened with such intensity that he mistook silence for devotion. Slowly the rhythm of their encounters changed. She began to withdraw, not abruptly but with calculated grace, an absence here, a delayed visit there. And in that withdrawal she taught him hunger. This was her art stage scarcity. The hippodrome had taught her that crowds crave what they cannot touch. Now she applied that lesson to a single man. When Justinian sent gifts, she returned half. When he summoned her, she arrived late but serene. Each refusal increased his fixation. It was not cruelty, it was design. She was programming a prince. Intellectual intimacy soon blurred into emotional dependence. Justinian began confiding in her not about politics but about doubt. The weight of power, the loneliness of command, the ghosts of those he had outmaneuvered. He spoke of his fear that faith and governance could never coexist, that every law he passed carried a sin. Theodora listened like a confessor. She knew the architecture of guilt. She had lived inside it. Her responses were measured, sympathetic, threaded with just enough mystery to make him believe he was discovering wisdom rather than being guided toward it. In her presence, Justinian felt seen. In his presence, she felt the future crystallizing. By the time their relationship became public enough to stir whispers, it was already too late. The palace noticed the subtle rearrangements of hierarchy, ministers waiting longer for audiences, petitions delayed because the prince was consulting with Theodora. The same senators who once laughed at circus girls now trembled at how often her name appeared on memoranda and invitations. What scandalized them was not merely her presence, it was her influence. In a city built on lineage and law, Theodora represented everything the elites pretended did not exist. The permeability of class, the intelligence of the uneducated, the survival of the condemned. The senators whispered in corridors lined with porphyry and guilt. A prostitute advising a prince, they sneered. A heretic whispering into the ear of power. But Justinian ignored them. Or rather, he believed he was ignoring them. In truth, he was defending himself. Every insult they hurled at her became an attack on his own judgment. Theodora had bound him through empathy. She had made herself the reflection of his better nature. To despise her would be to admit he could be deceived. At feasts, when courtiers mocked the lower orders, Justinian grew cold. When bishops denounced Monophysite sympathizers, he changed the subject. When senators tried to discuss the latest tax reforms, his thoughts drifted. Theodora's vocabulary, mercy, suffering, redemption had begun to replace the bureaucratic language of law. It was no longer performance, it was reprogramming. He who had spent his life mastering others through rules now found himself mastered through feeling. Theodora's genius was not to seduce the body, but to rewrite the mind's architecture of need. She created a world in which his morality required her presence to function. The scandal spread quickly. Priests debated whether repentance could ever wash away theatrical sin. Senators protested that no law could permit an emperor's heir to marry an infamous, a woman legally equated with a prostitute. Pamphlets circulated through the markets comparing her rise to the temptations of Eve. In the hippodrome itself, whispers ran along the benches, the dancer and the prince. Some cheered her audacity, others spat on the ground at her name, yet for every enemy she gained, she won 2 allies among the forgotten actresses, artisans, widows, servants. The empire's invisible half began to watch her ascent with secret hope, and still Justinian defended her. At council meetings, when advisers warned that association with a courtesan would doom his claim to legitimacy, he replied with calm certainty, virtue is not inherited, it is chosen. He believed he was speaking as a philosopher. He did not realize he was speaking her words. By the time the court understood that Theodora was not a passing infatuation, but a fixture, the transformation was complete. The careful equilibrium of the Byzantine elite bloodlines, reputation, decorum had been breached by something far older and more dangerous human connection. The empire had always been ruled by hierarchy. Now for the first time it was being ruled by intimacy. And in the quiet chambers of the palace, as Justinian drifted between prayer and passion, Theodora observed him the way a scientist studies a specimen, gently, curiously, without malice, but with absolute clarity. She had spent her childhood learning how power behaves when it feels invulnerable. Now she was watching that lesson unfold inside the most powerful man in the world. The senators would call it corruption. The clergy would call it blasphemy. Theodora would call it education. Every empire draws its boundaries in ink and hypocrisy. For Justinian, the obstacle to marrying Theodora was not love nor scandal, it was the law. Roman law, centuries old and stubborn as bone, drew a line that no affection could cross. Senators, governors, and men of rank were forbidden to marry actresses, dancers, or prostitutes. The law did not distinguish between performance and prostitution, it assumed the same moral contamination. Once branded infamis, always infamis. It was a stain written into the flesh of the law itself. The rule dated back to Augustus, that austere emperor who believed morality could be legislated into existence. Under his decrees, the stage was an open sewer, and those who stepped upon it, no matter how briefly, were forever marked. Byzantium, in all its Christian splendour, had inherited that pagan cruelty intact. To repeal it would not only upend centuries of legal precedent, but humiliate an entire class of senators who prided themselves on purity. For Justinian to marry Theodora would mean rewriting the social code that defined who could touch divinity and who could not. But one person more than law or senator stood in the way: Empress Euphemia, wife of Emperor Justin I. Justinian's uncle was a woman who understood power's cost better than anyone alive. She too had begun in bondage. Born a slave freed through her master's affection, she had risen to the highest position a woman could hold. She had spent decades transforming herself into an emblem of virtue, the empire's moral matron. To her, respectability was not inheritance, it was labour, and she saw in Theodora not a reflection but a threat. When Euphemia first heard of her nephew's attachment, she reportedly said only one word: no. But behind that word lay an entire history of struggle. She knew what it meant to claw one's way from degradation to dignity. She had done it by suppressing her past, by proving daily that she was nothing like the woman she used to be. Theodora, by contrast, flaunted her transformation. She turned sin into philosophy, pain into performance. To Euphemia this was heresy, not theological but moral. She summoned Theodora to the palace under the pretense of kindness. The meeting, as chroniclers later recorded, was polite-icy in its precision. Euphemia received her in a hall of white marble surrounded by eunuchs and icons, a scene designed to remind Theodora where holiness lived. The older woman listened as Theodora spoke of repentance, of God's mercy, of the new life she hoped to build beside Justinian. Then Euphemia leaned forward and said softly, "I climbed from slavery to the throne, but I was never a prostitute." There was no venom in her tone, only clarity. She understood the cost of survival, but she also understood the fragility of the Empire's illusions. If the public saw the future Empress as a woman from the arena, the entire theology of divine kingship would fracture. How could an empire claim God's favour when its rulers broke the moral architecture that defined their authority? For Euphemia, this was not personal. It was existential. She refused Justinian's repeated petitions. She blocked every proposal for legal revision. When he attempted to slip a draft amendment through the bureaucracy, she intercepted it. When courtiers pleaded on his behalf, she silenced them with a look. Her command carried the weight of sanctity. Justinian, who could out-argue bishops and generals, found himself helpless before one quiet word from his aunt unfit. Behind her refusal lay a memory. Euphemia remembered what it meant to be despised. She remembered the humiliation of being bought, sold, and pitied. She had spent her life burying those memories beneath silken ceremony, and she sensed that Theodora had no intention of burying hers. Where Euphemia built walls, Theodora wielded mirrors, and that difference terrified her. To the Empress, Theodora was not merely a scandal waiting to happen. She was a revolution embodied in flesh, a living argument that the Empire's hierarchies could be rewritten. Outside the palace, gossip spread. In the taverns, people debated whether the prince had lost his senses. In the churches, priests warned that moral decay at the top would invite divine punishment. The Blues and Greens, ever attuned to opportunity, turned the affair into a factional weapon. The Blues whispered that the prince's love proved compassion for the commoners. The Greens sneered that even the heir to heaven's empire could be undone by a circus girl. In this storm of rumour, Theodora stayed silent. She had learned long ago that silence is not surrender. It is observation. She watched the Empress closely, not with hatred, but with curiosity. She understood that Euphemia's opposition was not cruelty but fear. Fear that the same path of survival that had elevated her would, through another woman, expose how fragile it truly was. For months, the Empire seemed suspended between two women, one who had risen by erasing her past, and one who had risen by owning it. Both had survived systems designed to consume them. Both refused to be erased again. The difference was that only one could remain at the centre. In the annals of power, they would never meet again. But history remembers what neither of them could have said aloud, that the law forbidding their kinship was not merely a statute, it was a cage built to contain the memory of women like them, and one of them was about to break it. It happened quietly, as power's most decisive moments often do not with thunder, but with the absence of breath. On a winter night in 523 CE, Empress Euphemia went to sleep in her chambers at the Palace of Daphne and never woke again. No illness had been reported, no signs of decline recorded. One day she was attending Mass, the next her attendants found her motionless, her hands folded across the silks she had once worn like armour. The court physicians muttered about age exhaustion, the weight of years in gilded rooms. But Byzantium was a city addicted to interpretation. In the taverns and baths, people whispered that the timing was too precise to be coincidence. For months, Euphemia had stood between Justinian and Theodora, an unmovable pillar of morality, the last guardian of the old Roman hierarchy. Her death removed that barrier with the precision of a signature cut from a scroll. Did Theodora have a hand in it? The question has haunted every chronicler since. To speak it aloud in the 6th century was dangerous. To ignore it entirely was dishonest. Theodora's knowledge of herbs and narcotics was no secret. An education common among actresses trained to protect themselves from violent clients. She knew which roots dulled pain, which powders soothed, and which in excess stopped the heart. Yet the Empire's archives contain no accusation, no trial, not even a whisper in official correspondence. Only chance, the kind that suggests fear or respect. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps it was providence. What matters more than cause was consequence. Within days of the funeral, Emperor Justin, aged pious, and increasingly dependent on his brilliant nephew, began drafting a new decree. It bore the sterile title of reform, yet its intent was unmistakable. The law explicitly allowed men of senatorial rank to marry women of irregular status, provided they had demonstrated chastity and good conduct. In other words, it legalized Theodora. The document still survives a few brittle lines of Latin, whose language cannot conceal their singular purpose. Jurists later noted how narrow its scope was, how perfectly tailored to one case. It did not overturn the concept of infamia. It merely carved a window through it just wide enough for one woman to pass. For Justinian, the law was justification cloaked in legal precision. For Theodora, it was vindication written into marble. The senators were aghast. They called it an abomination, a corruption of the moral order. But they underestimated how carefully Justinian had prepared the ground. The empire was exhausted by famine and administrative chaos. Few dared to challenge the man already running its bureaucracy in all but name. The new legislation passed not with applause but with resignation. Some claimed Justin wept when he signed it. Others said his hand trembled, guided by Justinian's. Whether from age or complicity, the act was done. And so the ancient barrier, the wall between stage and senate, between spectacle and sanctity, cracked. The law that had condemned thousands of women to invisibility now served as a bridge for one of them. The rumour of poison faded, but the pattern remained. Whenever history cannot admit transformation, it invents conspiracy. Whether Theodora had plotted Euphemia's death or merely waited for inevitability, the effect was the same. A door had opened and she stepped through without looking back. The following spring, Constantinople hummed with a nervous kind of awe. The prince was preparing to marry a woman the law itself had once forbidden him even to touch. To some it was a scandal, to others a miracle. But to Theodora it was neither. It was simply the conclusion of a long calculation, the moment when survival became sovereignty. That night, as the bells of Hagia Sophia tolled for evening prayer, the city's widows and workers whispered her name with a mixture of disbelief and produl. The courtiers, polished and perfumed, could not yet grasp what had happened. A single death had rewritten the code of empire. Whether that death came from nature, negligence, or intention, the truth was irrelevant. In Byzantium, what mattered was outcome, not cause. And the outcome was this: a law had changed. A woman had ascended, and the empire, without knowing it, had begun to change with her. The wedding of Justinian and Theodora in 525 CE was not a ceremony. It was an act of legislation disguised as love. The empire called it a marriage, but it was closer to a proclamation, an announcement that the social order once carved in marble could be rewritten in flesh. It took place within the gleaming walls of Hagia Sophia long before its later reconstruction turned it into the architectural wonder known today. The church, draped in crimson banners, smelled of frankincense and wax. The marble floor, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected 100 oil lamps that burned in honour of divine union. The clergy presided with solemnity, their chants echoing through domes that blurred heaven and state. But even as they spoke of sanctity, everyone present knew this was not merely a blessing of hearts, it was the consecration of a political alliance. Theodora entered not as a bride, but as a policy. Her white veil shimmered like armour. Every step down the aisle was both triumph and transgression. A decade earlier, the law had named her infamis unfit to testify, inherit, or marry a man of rank. Now that same law had been amended to permit her passage. In the eyes of the court, she was the living symbol of the empire's new flexibility, or its decay, depending on who one asked. To the senators and aristocrats, it was scandal refined into ritual. They had spent their lives polishing ancestry, weaving their lineages into the myth of divine right. And now before their eyes, a woman who had once danced for coins was being crowned equal to an emperor. To the clergy, it was a theological puzzle. Could grace truly elevate the profane? Could the sanctity of marriage erase the sins of spectacle? Patriarch Epiphanius hesitated before placing his hand upon their joined palms. Some said his voice faltered during the prayer. Others claimed the candles flickered unnaturally in the still air. Byzantium thrived on such omens. But to the people, the thousands gathered outside the church waiting in the square, it was something else entirely. The poor, the artisans, the performers and the widows saw in Theodora's ascent a kind of vindication. A woman of the streets had entered the palace not by birth or inheritance, but by intellect, endurance and unflinching will. For once, the empire's stories of redemption had stepped off the parchment and into the world. Inside the church, as the final vows were spoken, Justinian's face was unreadable. He had always believed governance to be a divine vocation. In marrying Theodora, he was not defying the gods, he was enlisting them. She embodied what his new empire would claim to be a place where order and mercy could coexist, where the past was not a prison but a curriculum. Every element of the ceremony was choreographed with imperial precision. The choir sang not of romantic love, but of divine justice. The purple robes awaiting Theodora after the rite had been embroidered, with symbols of authority, the cross, the peacock emblem of immortality, and the phoenix rising from flame. When the crown was placed upon her head, she did not bow. She raised her chin eyes steady, her expression neither humble nor proud, merely inevitable. It was a moment that shocked the courtiers who expected gratitude. But Theodora was not grateful. Gratitude implies debt. She considered the moment payment in full. From that day forward, she was no longer the penitent actress or the prince's lover. She was Augusta, co-ruler in title and soon in power. The symbolism was immense. Theodora's elevation sent messages through every stratum of society. To the Blues faction, who had supported her family in ruin, it was a triumph. They now had an empress whose favour could secure appointments and contracts. To the Greens, who had betrayed her father, it was humiliation incarnate. To the army, whose loyalty depended on perception, it signalled that the imperial household was not divided. That Justinian's heart and thus his empire belonged to a woman who would fight as fiercely as any general to defend it. Within days of the ceremony, official portraits were commissioned. In them Justinian and Theodora appear side by side, not as man and wife, but as dual icons. She holds a golden chalice symbol of spiritual authority. He a globe topped with a cross symbol of worldly dominion. The message was unmistakable. Rome's successor was now ruled by two minds, not one. Outside the palace, the gossip never stopped. Aristocrats muttered that this union would doom the empire to moral collapse. Monks in the desert wrote letters warning that female ambition was a symptom of apocalypse. But others saw something revolutionary. The idea that a woman's experience, even one rooted in humiliation, could translate into governance. Theodora understood the optics better than anyone. She made sure the story of her conversion circulated widely, that she was a sinner, redeemed, chosen by God to counsel the most powerful man on earth. In this framing, her past became not a stain but a credential. When she walked through the city streets as Augusta for the first time, crowds lined the route, waving palm branches and chanting hymns. But behind the hymns lay a deeper current of fascination, even fear. She was both miracle and warning, the proof that the empire's hierarchies could be inverted overnight. Justinian, for all his intellect, may never have fully grasped what he had unleashed. His marriage had created more than a partnership. It had created a precedent that the imperial body was not untouchable, that divinity could wear the face of a former performer. From the pulpit of Hagia Sophia that day, the empire announced not just a union, but a new theology of power, one in which mercy could be mistaken for destiny and ambition could masquerade as divine will. Theodora knew it better than anyone in that vast echoing church. She did not marry into the empire, she married over it. Marriage had given Theodora a crown, practice would give her an empire. After 525, Justinian's palace changed in ways so subtle the court didn't notice until they were permanent. The rhythms of governance, audiences, petitions, councils remained the same, but their tone shifted. Theodora did not reign with decrees, she reigned through arrangement. Every room she entered seemed to reorder itself. At dawn, she and Justinian prayed together before the small icon of Christ Pantocrator in their private chapel. Courtiers described how they knelt side by side in silence, two silhouettes in flickering candlelight. Yet the stillness was deceptive. When the prayers ended, their work began. Petitions arrived by the hundreds, disputes over property, accusations of corruption, appeals from exiles and widows. Justinian preferred cases framed in law. Theodora preferred those framed in pain. She had lived the system's cruelty and she never forgot it. When she read a plea written in a woman's desperate hand, she did not pass it to a clerk. She summoned the petitioner herself. Those audiences became legend. She received them not from a throne but from a simple seat beneath a tapestry depicting the Last Judgment. The message was unmistakable. Justice began here. Soldiers trembling under accusation, merchants accused of fraud, women accused of adultery. All were startled by the directness of her questions. She had no patience for rhetoric. If she sensed deceit, her eyes turned cold as coin. If she sensed truth, her voice softened with terrifying calm. "Do not lie to me," she once told a prefect who tried to defend his cruelty. "I have lived where your lies begin." She did not sign decrees herself, at least not yet, but her influence was stitched into every decision that bore Justinian's seal. Her approval determined promotions within the palace. Her disfavour could end a career before dawn. Eunuchs, chamberlains, clerks all learned to read the inflection of her silence. The empire's bureaucracy, that vast grinding machine, had acquired a new and unexpected conscience, fear wrapped in admiration. Theodora understood hierarchy the way an architect understands weight. She didn't need to dismantle it. She only needed to shift its balance. The ministers soon learned that the safest path to imperial favour ran through her antechamber. Petitioners waited there for hours, their scrolls damp with anxiety, listening to the rhythmic click of her stylus against parchment, a sound that meant she was thinking, calculating, deciding which requests would reach the emperor's desk. By evening, the palace transformed again. Theodora moved among courtiers with deliberate grace, listening more than speaking. At banquets, when debates flared over doctrine or taxation, she intervened not with argument, but with parable. The ship that fears the storm, she once said softly, should not boast of its sails. The room fell silent. Justinian smiled. No one dared speak after her. Her authority grew most quietly in matters of discipline. She reorganized the palace staff, replacing gossipers and sycophants with loyal freedwomen, many of whom she had personally rescued from brothels. The senators called it scandalous. She called it efficiency. To the servants, she was not merely empress, but protector. When they passed her in corridors, they bowed with a devotion no legislation could command. Even Justinian's generals, Belisarius, Mundus, Narcissus, found themselves measuring their words before her. She never questioned strategy, but she always asked the question soldiers dreaded, and when the battle is won, who will care for the widows? Her calm interrogation exposed the moral hollowness that empire often mistakes for pragmatism. In these years, no one yet spoke of Theodora's domination. The empire still viewed her as the emperor's consort, wise but secondary. That illusion suited her. Influence thrives in the shade. She cultivated the image of serenity, of divine composure. Yet beneath the marble poise, her mind remained the same instrument forged in the hippodrome, measuring leverage, anticipating collapse. The palace itself became her map. Every corridor had a purpose, every conversation a signal. Theodora's attendants kept meticulous notes on who visited whom, which officials lingered too long in certain chambers, which servants carried messages between factions. She never confronted spies, she redirected them. Misinformation became her currency. Those who thought they manipulated her were merely confirming her suspicions. Her partnership with Justinian deepened in ways neither fully defined. He governed by intellect, she governed by intuition. He saw structures, she saw currents. Together they created the illusion of omniscience. He relied on her not only for counsel but for equilibrium. When courtiers disagreed, he asked, "What says my Augusta?" and her judgment carried the final word. It was during these tranquil years that the empire mistook stability for permanence. The reforms that would define Justinian's reign, tax restructuring, codification of laws, architectural renewal, were still drafts on parchment. The fires that would soon consume Constantinople had not yet been sparked, but anyone who watched closely could sense the tension beneath the marble calm. Theodora's changes had disturbed old networks of privilege. The senators whose daughters she refused to marry into power seethed in private. The Greens, still humiliated by her family's history, whispered that the Empress sought revenge, and within the monasteries the Orthodox clergy grew uneasy at her continued sympathy for the Monophysites. Whispers began to circulate again, this time not about scandal but about sovereignty. Was Justinian still emperor, or was he merely the husband of one Theodora never answered? She didn't need to. Her power was not loud, and that made it more permanent. While others plotted in shadow, she was building architecture, invisible, intricate, resilient. Every favour granted, every punishment delayed, every silence maintained, was a brick in the foundation of an empire that could not yet imagine the storm it was preparing to endure. Soon that architecture would be tested, and when it was the world would discover that the quiet empress who smiled politely beside her husband had learned her lessons not in palaces, but in arenas of sand and blood. January 532 CE began with a city smouldering under its own brilliance. Constantinople glittered outwardly, its marble arcades, its golden domes, its endless ceremonies, but beneath that surface lay exhaustion. Justinian's reforms had drained the treasury and tightened taxes. Bureaucrats, efficient and merciless, enforced levies with the precision of blades. The people who once chanted "Long live the Emperor" now whispered curses under their breath, and the hippodrome, that ancient stage of unity and spectacle, had become an engine of fury. The blues and greens, whose rivalries once fueled sport, now shared a common grievance: oppression. For the first time in living memory, the colours of the factions bled into one. When enemies join hands, power trembles. It began as a riot after an execution. 2 condemned men, one blue and one green, escaped the gallows and found sanctuary in a church. The crowd pleaded for mercy. Justinian refused. On race day, when this emperor appeared in his box, the hippodrome erupted, not in cheers, but in a chant that struck like thunder. "Nika! Conquer!" At first it was ambiguous. Were they cheering the charioteers or calling for rebellion? By the end of the day, ambiguity burned to ash. The city became a furnace. The baths of Zeuxippus went up in flames. then the basilicas, then entire quarters of the capital. The mob roamed the streets, chanting the single word that had once meant glory but now meant war. Theodora watched from the palace balconies as the sky turned red and the smoke swallowed the horizon. For 5 days, the empire's heart tore itself apart. Senators who had long despised Justinian saw their chance. They whispered to the rioters, promising a new emperor a return to ancient freedoms. The mob stormed the palace gates. Imperial guards died defending them. Inside, panic ruled. Ministers argued, generals shouted, courtiers wept. Justinian, pale and sleepless, summoned his advisers to the Great Hall. He spoke of retreat, of sailing for safety across the Bosporus until the revolt cooled. To stay, he said, was suicide. The council agreed. Every man there, ministers, treasurers, commanders, voted for flight. Every man except one. Theodora rose from her seat. The chronicler Procopius, who loathed her, still preserved her words. For once, even her enemies could not forget. My opinion is that the present time is not the right moment for flight. Though it may not be fitting for a woman to speak among men, those whose interests are in peril will not mind the source of good counsel. Her voice was calm, deliberate, lethal in its clarity. Whoever has worn the purple should never see it stripped away. Royalty is a fine burial shroud. The room fell silent. The emperor's advisers stared, unsure if they were hearing courage or madness. But Theodora's eyes, dark and unwavering, held them all. She reminded them of what power really was: not safety, not comfort, but endurance. If you wish to flee, Emperor, there are ships and gold enough, she said. But consider this: if you save your life today, you will die a fugitive tomorrow. As for me, I will stay. I accept that purple makes a good winding sheet. In that moment, the balance of the empire shifted. Justinian, shaken from despair, straightened his back. He looked at his generals Belisarius and Mundus and gave the order that would define his reign. Theodora had taught him well. Panic can be turned into plan if you strike before fear ripens into retreat. While the rioters celebrated their imagined victory, gathered again in the hippodrome to proclaim a rival emperor, imperial soldiers quietly sealed every exit. Belisarius positioned his troops at the gates. Mundus brought the Heruli mercenaries through the tunnels beneath the stands. The trap was set in the same arena where Theodora had once learned the art of spectacle. When the signal came, iron gates slammed shut. The crowd, more than 30,000 people, was caged in the same sand that had once soaked her childhood tears. No proclamation, no negotiation. Only silence followed by the terrible rhythm of marching boots. Belisarius's men advanced in ranks, swords drawn, methodical, wordless. Those who begged for mercy were cut down. The slaughter lasted for hours. Blood filled the channels meant for chariot wheels. The same terraces that once echoed with applause now shook with the screams of citizens. When it was over, the hippodrome was a grave. Theodora stood at a window overlooking the aftermath. Smoke curled upward from the ruined districts. The air smelled of ash and iron. She did not flinch. To those who would later call her monstrous, remember this: she had seen what weakness costs. She had learned early that mercy in a world built on cruelty was often fatal. That week became known simply as the Nika Revolt, but among the courtiers who survived it was remembered as the Week of Purple. It was the moment the empire was remade not through conquest but through annihilation. In the smouldering silence that followed, Justinian moved swiftly. The senators who had conspired were executed or exiled, the palace rebuilt, and over the ashes of the burned basilica rose a new monument, Hagia Sophia reborn from destruction, a cathedral meant to proclaim divine order restored. But every stone laid in its foundation carried a shadow. Theodora's defiance had saved the throne and killed tens of thousands. The empire was stable again, cold, absolute, and drenched in the logic she had learned in the arena that survival, once begun in humiliation, could only be maintained through ruthless symmetry. From that day forward, no one doubted who ruled Constantinople. Justinian wore the crown, but Theodora had earned it. In the aftermath of the Nika Revolt, the empire rebuilt itself, not only in stone but in language. Where fire had burned away the city's illusions, law would now rebuild its conscience. Justinian's great project, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, was meant to cleanse centuries of confusion. Roman decrees, imperial edicts, contradictory rulings, all would be gathered, revised, and rewritten into one coherent code. It was to be the empire's mirror, reflecting not chaos, but clarity. And though the text bears Justinian's name, its heartbeat often sounded like Theodora's. She had no formal role in the commission that drafted the laws, yet her influence seeped through them like dye in cloth. The emperor's jurists, men of parchment and precedent, understood that certain reforms came from beyond their circle, born of a voice that did not speak in their councils but was heard in every decision. Theodora understood that survival must eventually translate into statute. Without law, justice is a rumour. Her fingerprints appear most clearly in the legislation that dealt with women, poverty and exploitation, the same machinery that had once consumed her. One edict forbade the coercion of women into prostitution. Another ordered that any woman trapped in a brothel could leave freely, and that no owner or client had legal claim over her body. For the first time, the law acknowledged consent not as moral decoration, but as civic fact. She knew precisely what she was dismantling, the same legal logic that had once equated actresses and prostitutes that had branded her infamous. Her reforms did not erase that word, but they began to hollow it out. Another law struck deeper. If a man committed rape regardless of his rank, his property would be confiscated and granted to the victim. For centuries, Roman law had treated rape as a crime against a family's honour, or a husband's rights, not the woman herself. Now the victim was recognised as the injured party and the beneficiary of justice. It was a legal inversion vengeance, rewritten as compensation, humiliation, recast as empowerment. Theodora also extended protection to abandoned infants, ordering that foundlings raised by charitable institutions could not be reclaimed by biological parents seeking profit. In every measure one sees her awareness that power preys on dependency, and that law must become the shield of the dependent. But even mercy in Byzantium was never free of control. The same empress who liberated women from brothels also built institutions to contain them. Her most famous foundation, the Metanoia convent on the Asian shore of the Bosporus, was both sanctuary and system. There hundreds of former prostitutes and enslaved women were given food, clothing and a place to sleep. They were taught to pray to So to live in chastity. Theodora visited, often speaking to them not as ruler but as one who remembered. "You have seen darkness," she told them, "and now you will learn peace." Yet the convent's gates locked from the outside. Women who tried to leave were pursued. Many accustomed to the noise and freedom of the city could not endure the silence of salvation. Some fled, others drowned themselves in the waters below. Theodora did not see cruelty in this. She saw order structure imposed upon chaos. To her, redemption without discipline was only another form of bondage. Her laws and her institutions mirrored the paradox of her life liberation through control, protection through confinement. It was a pattern the empire itself would inherit. Even the language of the new code bears her touch. Legal scholars have noted a strange duality in its tone, stern yet compassionate, punitive yet protective. Beneath the jurist's technical Latin, one senses a different cadence, almost maternal. Let there be no exploitation among those who serve the empire. Let none compel the unwilling. Let no man's lust outweigh the dignity of a woman. For the first time, justice spoke in the grammar of empathy, but Theodora's influence reached beyond compassion. She recognized that law was not only moral structure, it was propaganda. By encoding mercy into the empire's statutes, Justinian and Theodora reshaped public perception. The same rulers who had ordered the massacre of 30,000 citizens could now present themselves as architects of divine justice. Blood had been washed in ink. When the Corpus Juris Civilis was finally completed, its preface declared that the emperor ruled as God's steward on earth, uniting wisdom and mercy. Scholars see Justinian's hand in the wisdom. The mercy, however, carries Theodora's rhythm. In a society that had defined her as property, she had redefined property itself. In a civilization that had called her impure, she had written purity into law not as a virtue of birth, but as a right of survival. And though she could never erase the violence that shaped her, she had forced the empire to remember it differently. The wounds of the Hippodrome translated into legislation became a warning carved into the civilization's bones. Her reforms were not perfect. They carried the contradictions of their maker, tenderness forged in cruelty order, born of fear. Yet centuries later, when jurists in Europe built their own legal systems upon Justinian's code, Theodora's shadow travelled with them. They did not know her name, but they lived under her corrections. Every empire must tell a story about itself, and in Byzantium, that story was told through faith. To rule was not simply to govern, but to perform divinity, to make power visible, to give it a liturgy. After the revolt's ashes cooled, Theodora and Justinian faced a subtler war belief itself. The Nika week had proven that swords could suppress rebellion, but not conviction. The empire was still divided by a question older than both of them, the nature of Christ. Was he one or two, divine only, or divine and human together? To the theologians it was metaphysics, to the emperor and empress it was logistics, because every creed was also a map of bishops, monasteries, taxes and loyalties. Orthodoxy defined borders more effectively than armies. Justinian, ever the systematizer, wanted unity through doctrine. Theodora, who had lived outside the lines of law and purity, understood that unity through force was brittle. While her husband legislated belief, she negotiated it. In secret correspondence and quiet patronage, she supported the Monophysites, those who saw divinity and humanity as one nature indivisible. They were her people, outcast of orthodoxy, persecuted yet resilient. Their persecution mirrored her own life story. She saw in them not just believers but survivors. When imperial agents arrested Monophysite monks, Theodora intervened, sometimes directly summoning bishops to the palace and scolding them with a sharpness that made even patriarchs blanch, sometimes indirectly arranging safe passage for refugees, funding hidden monasteries, using her own fortune to buy the freedom of imprisoned clerics. Procopius, her bitter chronicler, accused her of heresy. He wasn't entirely wrong. Theodora's faith was political, but it was also personal. She believed that mercy had more longevity than enforcement. Her Christianity was shaped not by the pulpit, but by the memory of being denied sanctuary. To stabilize the empire, she and Justinian divided their roles as if by instinct. He was the theologian emperor writing letters to popes, presiding over councils, crafting doctrines. She was the quiet counterweight, the diplomat in silk, the intercessor who whispered reconciliation where his decrees created fractures. Theodora's tools were patronage, charity and image. She financed orphanages, hospitals and hostels for travellers, acts of mercy that doubled as statecraft. Each foundation proclaimed a subtle message: divine favour rests upon those who serve. Every loaf of bread given to a beggar was also an argument for imperial legitimacy. Nowhere was this symbiosis of faith and propaganda more visible than in art. Theodora understood the theatre of belief, how light and colour could persuade where words failed. The empire's artists, glaziers and mosaicists became her theologians. In the distant city of Ravenna, where the imperial presence still pulsed through Italy's fading provinces, a new basilica rose, San Vitale. When its mosaics were unveiled, they were more than decoration. They were political scripture rendered in glass and gold. On one wall, Justinian stands, haloed, flanked by soldiers and bishops. He holds a golden bowl, symbol of offering of divine stewardship. Opposite him, in mirror symmetry, stands Theodora. Her robe glitters with pearls, her face calm and unflinching. She too wears a halo, not metaphorical but literal. Behind her, attendants hold open a curtain revealing a doorway that seems to lead toward the altar itself. The message was audacious. The Empress was not the Emperor's ornament, but his counterpart in sanctity. Two halves of authority, two embodiments of the same divine order. Her garment is embroidered with the three magi bearing gifts to the Christ child. A visual sermon that redefines gender and power. Theodora presents herself as both giver and given, as mortal and sacred. The imagery proclaimed what no decree dared: state salvation of the empire was a duet. Even the composition of the mosaic whispers strategy. Justinian faces the clergy anchoring authority and orthodoxy. Theodora faces the laity extending compassion to the world beyond the church doors. Between them, the space of the nave becomes the empire itself, divided yet reconciled through art. This was not vanity, it was theology turned into architecture. Every tessera of glass, each inch of golden mortar reinforced the empire's narrative that its rulers stood between heaven and earth, arbiters of order, in a world perpetually on the verge of collapse. In her later years, Theodora spent more time in chapels than in councils, yet her presence radiated through both. The courtiers who dismissed her as pious decoration failed to see that faith was her final instrument of governance. She understood that belief once performed becomes habit, and habit becomes structure. When she attended Mass in Hagia Sophia, she did so beneath the colossal dome that seemed to float on light. The choir's chants rose like tides, erasing the boundary between body and spirit. She knew the illusion well, she had built her life upon it. The difference now was that she commanded it. Through charity, patronage and art, she transformed religion into policy, and policy into performance. The empire that once fed on spectacle had learned under her hand to disguise its hunger as holiness. Faith was no longer merely worship, it was stagecraft, and Theodora, the child of the arena, had finally mastered her greatest stage. In the Byzantine court, love was a tax, and marriage was its collection. Every union forged beneath the palace vaults carried an invoice written in policy alliances, tallied loyalties, purchased bloodlines, arranged into equations that no poet could ever untangle. By the 530s, Theodora had turned this arithmetic into art. She who had once been condemned for transgressing the social order now administered it with surgical precision. The empire rebuilt after rebellion required not only laws and faith but continuity, an unbroken chain of loyalty connecting generals, governors and aristocrats to the imperial will. Theodora understood better than Justinian that dynasties do not begin in cradles, they begin in corridors. Every marriage she brokered, every match she forbade rewove the web of Byzantine power. The chronicles speak dryly of imperial arrangements, but in practice they were human dramas conducted at the edge of survival. Senators' daughters found themselves pledged to aging administrators they barely knew. Generals' sons were married off to provincial heiresses, whose dowries could buy an army's loyalty. Each union was a ledger entry in the balance between control and rebellion. Theodora orchestrated them all. Her most trusted agents, eunuchs, chamberlains, widows who owed her everything, served as her eyes and ears. They gathered gossip, assessed temperaments, and reported which households were rising too swiftly, which alliances threatened to coalesce into opposition. If a family grew too powerful, she diluted it through marriage to lesser names. If an ally needed elevation, she arranged a match into prestige. To those who resisted her plans, she offered choice disguised as grace. The empire, she would murmur, is a family too, and families require harmony. Few dared refuse. Those who did soon found their estates audited, their privileges revoked, or their sons reassigned to distant garrisons where ambition dissolved into sand. Even Justinian's inner circle was not immune. Generals Belisarius and Narses, heroes of conquest, found their households bound by the Empress's logic. Belisarius's wife Antonina became Theodora's confidant, spy, and sometimes executioner of will. Their friendship, equal parts devotion and fear, became one of the strangest partnerships in imperial history. Two women veterans of humiliation now commanding through rumour and intimacy. Antonina's reports reached Theodora before any ministers. Together they mapped not the frontiers of land but of loyalty. When dissent rippled through the provinces, it was often quelled not by swords but by weddings. To outsiders these manipulations seemed cold, but Theodora never saw them as cruelty. She saw them as inoculation. The empire was too vast, too volatile to survive without engineered intimacy. Every marriage she arranged was a safety valve against civil war. Every heart she broke was a calculation toward peace. Still, the system exacted its toll. In the shadows of these orchestrated unions lived the forgotten, the women forced into vows they did not choose, the men whose love became an inconvenience to empire. For them, Theodora's compassion, so evident in her laws, seemed to vanish within the palace's marble walls. One story preserved by later chroniclers tells of a young noblewoman named Juliana, whose father opposed Justinian's tax reform. To secure his compliance, Theodora arranged Juliana's marriage to a loyal official 3 times her age. When the girl begged for mercy, Theodora listened without expression. "Better a dull husband than a dead father," she said quietly, and the marriage went ahead. There was no malice in her voice, only exhaustion, the fatigue of someone who knew that mercy and policy rarely shared the same bed. Her methods worked. By the mid-530s, the court's old factions were subdued. The senators, once the architects of revolt, were now entangled in alliances too complex to unravel without destroying themselves. The army, bound by marriages linking officers to imperial kin, found its loyalties braided into the throne. Even the clergy, divided between Nicene and Monophysite sympathies, learned that imperial favour flowed most freely through domestic harmony. To the empire's subjects, Theodora appeared as the serene axis around which everything revolved, the weaver of human fabric, the unseen hand that turned private life into public order. But there were limits to her control. When her reforms reached into families that still clung to the illusion of independence, resentment fermented. A few resisted openly. Theodora crushed them without spectacle, preferring disappearance to drama. One governor who refused to marry his daughter into a Monophysite household was found drowned in the Bosporus, his death recorded as an accident. No one believed it. Everyone understood. Theodora's power did not shout. It whispered a rumour, a nod, a gesture that changed destinies. In this she perfected the old Byzantine art of acrobatia, precision, without visibility. Through these years of control, her greatest weapon remained memory. She remembered what it was to be powerless to watch decisions made by others dictate survival. So she made sure no decision escaped her notice. Yet there is a certain irony history cannot ignore. The woman who had once fought to escape being used by powerful men had built a system where she now used others in the same way, binding bodies and hearts to purpose. She had learned the grammar of exploitation so fluently that she could conjugate it into policy. But in her own reckoning, this was not hypocrisy. It was evolution. The empire, like the human body, survived only through discipline and scar tissue. And as succession plans coalesced, marriages arranged, heirs designated, rivals neutralized, the Empress stood in the center of her living mosaic, calm as gold glass in candlelight. She had rewritten intimacy into infrastructure affection, into administration kinship, into command. In Byzantium, every household was now an echo of hers. By the year 548, the woman who had once outstared mobs and monarchs began to fade in silence. Theodora was 48, though the mirrors in her chambers were draped so she wouldn't have to see it. The legends say she grew pale and thin, her voice softer but no less deliberate. Physicians called it a wasting illness, perhaps cancer, perhaps something older and crueler. In a palace accustomed to command decline was treason. She tried to disguise the pain. For months she continued to receive envoys to sign petitions to oversee the Metanoia convent's accounts, but the strain showed. Courtiers noticed how her hands trembled when she lifted the imperial seal. She stopped attending morning councils. Her chair sat empty beside Justinian's. At first he refused to believe it. He who had codified the universe into law could not accept that the body he loved obeyed no decree. He ordered prayers in every basilica pilgrimages to relics doctors summoned from Alexandria and Antioch. None could help. The empire that once trembled before her whispers now tiptoed through her sick room. Procopius, her enemy, would later claim the court breathed relief. Yet those who served her knew the atmosphere was not relief but disbelief, the realization that for the first time in decades the palace no longer had two minds. In her final weeks she saw few people. Antonina came daily, sitting by the bedside, holding her hand in silence. Monophyle's clerics visited secretly, offering communion beneath drawn curtains. Theodora accepted the wafer with a faint smile. Whether it was faith or formality, no one could tell. One morning in June, the bells of Hagia Sophia tolled before sunrise, not for victory but for loss. The Empress was dead. The city held its breath. Justinian wept openly, a sight the empire had never witnessed. He who had faced revolts, plagues, and wars without visible fear broke before the quiet inevitability of her absence. Chroniclers record that he ordered her chamber, sealed her garments, left untouched her jewellery, locked away as relics of a saint. For the rest of his life he never remarried. In the 17 years that followed he ruled alone, an emperor diminished not in title but in tempo. The man who once dictated 100 laws a year produced fewer and fewer. His counsels grew cautious, his correspondence colder. The precision remained, but the pulse was gone. When he walked through the palace gardens, courtiers noticed how he turned toward the window of her old apartments as if expecting her silhouette to reappear. He commissioned new mosaics, not of battles or architecture, but of her face. One was placed in the palace chapel, another in Ravenna, her likeness gazing eternally toward the altar. In both she is larger than those around her, haloed the purple robe drawn close to her throat like the shroud she once named as her destiny. Her death marked not just the end of a partnership, but of an era when governance felt human erratic alive. After her the empire hardened. Justinian's later edicts bear the marks of solitude, abstract theological detached from flesh. What died with Theodora was immediacy, the voice that reminded power of hunger, of fear of the lives hidden behind statistics. What survived was her architecture laws that protected women from forced servitude, convents that sheltered the discarded, the moral expectation that rulers should answer to conscience as well as to code. Even her contradictions endured. The same statutes that freed victims also justified surveillance. The same charity that healed the poor reinforced imperial control. Her mercy and her rigour fused into the Byzantine temperament itself, compassion laced with caution. When Justinian died in 565, the empire buried him beside her in the Church of the Holy Apostles. Their tombs were plain by imperial standards, but the legend that surrounded them was not. The chroniclers wrote that a faint scent of myrrh lingered in the air for days, and that the candles above their graves never went out. Centuries later, travellers would still point to her mosaics and speak her name with a mix of awe and unease. She had risen from the gutters of the hippodrome to the vaults of sanctity, her story too improbable to be forgotten, and too disturbing to be retold without caution. What ended with her was the double heartbeat of the empire intellect and instinct, discipline and defiance. What outlived her was the memory that governance like faith is never pure. It is always written by human hands trembling between cruelty and grace. Theodora had understood that from the beginning. In life she called it strategy. In death it became history. History likes to canonize its monsters and forget the machinery that made them. It tells us Theodora was exceptional, that her rise from humiliation to holiness could only happen once. But that is the illusion empires prefer. What she truly reveals is not exception but pattern. Every civilization learns sooner or later how to convert suffering into structure. The hippodrome that trained children for degradation became the palace that trained officials for obedience. The brothel's logic control the body to command the soul was not abolished. It was refined into bureaucracy, ritual and law. When we speak of Theodora, we often speak of revenge or of genius or of survival. Yet beneath those words lies a quieter truth. Systems do not vanish when their victims rise. They evolve. The same empire that once sold her body later codified her mercy. The same techniques that crushed her childhood surveillance dependency spectacle became the tools of her rule. She did not invent cruelty. She inherited it, studied it, and perfected it until it obeyed her hand. That is the warning written beneath every mosaic. Every line of her legislation power digests pain. It consumes the wounds of the weak and turns them into new instruments of order. When Justinian's jurists inscribed her laws, they believed they were recording progress. And they were in part. Theodora's statutes freed thousands who would otherwise have been enslaved, protected the vulnerable, punished predators. But they also institutionalized her worldview, that control, if properly moralized, could be mistaken for compassion. Modern institutions still follow that template. The methods of change, no hippodrome, no chains, but the structure endures. We see it in systems that promise rehabilitation but demand submission, in bureaucracies that translate dependency into obedience, in workplaces and schools that reward exhaustion as virtue. The empires of today build their metanoias in glass and concrete, calling them wellness programs, correctional facilities, development plans. The language has softened, the premise has not. Theodora's life reminds us that survival alone is not redemption. She rose from the arena's dust, but she carried the arena with her. Her triumph was real, so were its costs. 30,000 bodies in the hippodrome proved that the abused can learn efficiency from their abusers, that trauma unexamined can reproduce itself in perfect symmetry. Every time we justify cruelty as necessity, every time we build hierarchies that trade security for submission, we repeat her experiment on a grander scale. The question is not whether we would have done better in her place. Few of us would have survived at all. The question is whether we can recognize the moment when endurance becomes domination, when discipline disguises itself as virtue. Because Theodora's story is not a moral fable, it is a mirror. It shows how intelligence, courage, and even compassion can be twisted into instruments of control when forged in the wrong fire. It shows that systems rarely die, they change owners. And it asks what we will do when they fall into our hands. Perhaps the only honest homage we can offer her is not admiration but vigilance, to remember that mercy administered from above can still be a cage, that institutions, once they learn the grammar of obedience, never forget it, and that the true measure of power is not who holds it, but whether it can choose restraint. Theodora's purple shroud was more than regalia. It was prophecy, a reminder that glory and guilt can be woven from the same thread, that every triumph written in suffering carries the seed of its own repetition. If her life warns us of anything, it is this. The moment we begin to confuse survival with justice, we risk building new empires from the ruins of empathy. History has already shown us where that path leads. The question still unanswered is whether we dare to step off it. The Purple Lesson. What Theodora's story teaches us about power, pain and transformation history rarely hands us clean examples of good and evil. More often it gives us people like Theodora complex, scarred, and uncomfortably human. Her life is not a fairy tale of redemption, nor a cautionary myth of corruption. It is something harder, and therefore more useful, a case study in how suffering can both elevate and distort us. Theodora began life as one of the most powerless people in the empire, a child stripped of protection, a performer reduced to spectacle. Yet within that brutality she learned how systems work. She discovered that desire can be predicted, that fear can be directed, that power feeds on attention. Years later, when she stood beside an emperor, she did not simply escape her past, she repurposed it. What had once destroyed her became the blueprint for her control. That transformation feels triumphant, but it carries an echo of warning. When we survive cruelty, we risk inheriting its logic. We learn the language of control too fluently and begin to speak it even when no one commands us to. Theodora's reign was brilliant, compassionate, and ruthless because she believed those things were inseparable. She had learned that mercy without authority invites exploitation, and authority without mercy invites chaos. Her solution was to merge them. In doing so, she saved thousands and terrified thousands more. Modern life is built on similar contradictions. The institutions we depend on, governments, corporations, even families, often mirror the empires they claim to have outgrown. They promise care but reward conformity. They talk about growth yet fear disruption. Like Theodora's metanoia convents, they protect by enclosing comfort, by commanding. The lesson is not to reject structure altogether, but to recognize when structure begins to devour freedom. Theodora teaches us to ask, what am I building from my own pain? Am I creating shelter or a new form of captivity? Her brilliance lay in seeing patterns of domination. Her tragedy lay in replicating them. To live differently, we must learn a subtler kind of strength, one that resists the temptation to control others as the proof that we have healed. We must understand that real power is not the ability to remake the world in our image, but the courage to let others remain unowned. In Theodora's mosaic at San Vitale, she stands haloed holding a chalice toward the altar. It is both an offering and a warning that what we raise in our hands, love, justice, leadership, can nourish or poison, depending on what we mix into it. She held hers steady because she knew how easily the contents spill. Her story reminds us that survival, though sacred, is only the first chapter. The greater task is to transform endurance into empathy and intelligence into integrity, to rise from pain without letting it write our ethics. If we can do that, we honour not the Empress who conquered, but the human being who endured and finally broke the cycle by teaching us to see it. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.